Hello and thanks for joining me. I'm making this video in response to hundreds of comments that I've had on the series of videos, three-part series of videos I made about my trip from the UK to the Swedish TET this summer. It's been amazing the number of views. I've had thousands of views on those videos, which is amazing considering that I only have a few hundred subscribers on this channel. So by the way, if you're watching my videos and enjoying them, please do subscribe to the channel. If nothing else, it'll make me feel better. So I've had many viewers asking me questions about, how did we plan the route, what did it cost, what did we take, etc. So I thought I would make this video in response to try and answer all of the questions that have been asked. So this is what I'm going to cover in this video. I will explain the route we took and how we navigated. I'll give you a detailed breakdown of the costs from the trip. I'll explain the bikes we used and the setup and the tyres. How we carried our luggage, kit list, where we stayed, how we found the accommodation, and also what we wore to ride in, and give you some feedback on pros and cons of the choices, because we had different choices between us. If you are only interested in one aspect of this or one part of it, then I will index this video. So if you look in the video description, there should be an index for you to be able to jump to the relevant section that you're interested in. Okay, so let's start with routes. We left the UK by catching the overnight ferry from Newcastle to Amsterdam, which docks in IJmuiden, just outside Amsterdam. And then we rode across Holland and Germany from IJmuiden all the way to Travemünde in one day. It's quite a long ride, and it was all on tarmac, but we just wanted to get that tarmac out of the way in one day. And then we caught another overnight ferry from Travemünde across to Malmö in Sweden, where we then immediately picked up the TET. If you can see from the details of the map here, when we rode up through Holland, we actually went across the Afsluitdijk, which goes across the IJsselmeer. It's a really spectacular ride, very, very long dam with the road, the motorway across the top of it. Great ride, great to stop halfway across, and there's an observation tower. Anyway, so we did all of that in one day, which is quite a long haul on the tarmac, but the bikes were happily buzzing along. We were cruising at about sort of 65, 70 miles an hour all the way, and that got us to the ferry, to the next overnight ferry in plenty of time. I'm going to jump ahead now to the return road journey from Sweden back to IJmuiden to catch the ferry back to the UK. So we took a different route on the way back. From Malmö, where we left the Swedish TET, we crossed the Öresund Bridge across from Sweden to Denmark, to Copenhagen in Denmark, and then we rode down through Denmark and caught the ferry across to Puttgarden in Germany. From there, then we rode just south of Hamburg and Bremen across Germany, back into Holland. We didn't take the north route through Groningen and round the IJsselmeer. We just took the fastest route down through Amsterdam. It's a bit congested, busy roads, but it's the fastest route back to IJmuiden and the ferry. So that return journey was just over 800 kilometers, about 500 miles, and we did that in 2 days. So that was an average of 250 miles a day, but that was all road work. Now, if you are interested in these routes, I will put the GPS files for these routes up on my Buy Me a Coffee account, where you will be able to download them for free. I just use the Buy Me a Coffee account to be able to share documents and files with people. You don't have to buy me a coffee, though if you would like to, of course, I would be delighted. I will put a link to those GPS routes in the description to this video for you. And finally, here's a map of the route that we took on the TET through Sweden. Now, I'm not going to share the GPS file for this because the TET does change from time to time, and so if you want to ride the Swedish TET, I recommend that you go onto the TET website just before you leave for your ride and download the latest version of the file. But I'll just explain. We rode from Malmo up. You can see we took a different route back down to coming up. We rode up to the Norwegian border. We just very briefly crossed into Norway. We didn't have time to actually do any riding in Norway. We followed the border up until we ran out of time, and then headed south again. So we did a total of 1,600 miles on the Swedish TET. That's about 2,600 kilometers. So we averaged about 260 kilometers a day whilst we were on the TET, and we did that very easily. And if you've watched the videos of the trip, you can see there were plenty of stops, unfortunately some breakdowns with Brian's bike. So, you know, we weren't riding hard every day. The riding on the Swedish TET is relatively easy. You can clock along at sort of 40, even 50 miles per hour, and just keep going that kind of speed all day. So it's fairly easy riding. So just to sum up the mileages, we did about 355 miles on the outward journey from the ferry terminal in Amsterdam to get to Sweden, about 500 miles on the way back, and we did about 1,600 miles whilst actually on the TET. So that's a total of 2,455 miles, if my maths is right, which is just under 4,000 kilometers. And that was in 2 weeks we did that. So that felt comfortable. That did not feel pushed. That was a nice, gentle pace. So that'll give you some kind of guide for what reasonable mileages are whilst travelling on that section of the TET. So I hope you found that useful. Let's move on then and talk about navigation. Now, I created all of the routes before we left the UK using Garmin Basecamp, just because that's what I'm used to using. And with Garmin Basecamp, you can create tracks as well as routes, which is far more useful for off-road and green lane riding. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about there, then you know you need to get your head into how Garmin systems work and what have you. But Brian used some app on his mobile phone. I'm not quite sure what it was to navigate. Peter didn't have navigation with him, he just followed the rest of us. But Shiplo and I both used Garmin Montanas, and we had the 600 series Montanas. And before we left the UK, I loaded on my Garmin the whole of Europe topo maps. So I was navigating with the Garmin topo maps right across Europe and then round Sweden, and they worked well. The topographical maps are the sort of European equivalent or worldwide equivalent of Ordnance Survey maps in the UK. They're nowhere near as detailed as Ordnance Survey maps, so when I'm riding in the UK I always use the Ordnance Survey maps, but for outside of the UK they're not available, so I use those topo maps, and they're plenty of detail. They're great. However, I would say this, because in Sweden just about all of the TET route is on roads as opposed to green lanes, you could probably get away with navigating the Swedish TET with a road-based GPS system such as a Garmin Zumo or even a TomTom. In many respects that would probably be easier if you're not used to using the more off-road oriented sat-nav systems. Okay, so let's move on and talk about choice of motorcycles, what bikes we rode on this trip. We all rode small bikes. We're all into lightweight adventure riding, and after this trip even more so, it's really reinforced in my mind that it's the way to go. Lightweight is the way to go, particularly if you're wanting to ride the TET and do green laning, off-road riding like this. So Peter had an older bike. He had an old Yamaha TTR 600, and that was actually the largest capacity bike, but obviously being older it wasn't the most powerful. Brian had his CCM 450, and Shiplo and I were both riding KTM 450s. We all had large capacity fuel tanks on. Brian's CCM has quite a large fuel tank anyway, but the Yamaha and the KTMs, we fitted larger range fuel tanks on there, and that was absolutely fine. You know, we had about 200 mile range comfortably on the bikes, so you know, fuel was not a problem. So I guess a couple of questions then from choice of bikes. Would bigger have been better? Well, not really, not on the TET. Perhaps for the road work, getting to and from Sweden, it would have been more comfortable on a larger bike. But it was fine. It was absolutely fine on the smaller bikes. As I said, we cruising across Germany, we stuck to about 65, 70, and that was absolutely fine. And, you know, the real advantage of riding a smaller bike is when you get on the TET, when you get on the loose surfaces, it's just so much easier to handle and maneuver, which for me is more enjoyable. It's less tiring, less stressful. You can really just enjoy the ride so much more on a smaller bike. I have to say, of the other riders that we met when we were on the TET, they were all on much bigger bikes, and you could ride the TET on any big bike, the Swedish TET on any big bike. So for example, I've got a Triumph Scrambler 1200. I would have felt very comfortable riding that on the TET. I could have equally have taken that bike and it would have been absolutely fine on the road. You can see from the video footage that I'm rolling whilst I'm talking to you, it's very easy going. There's just the odd bit that were a bit muddy and sticky and loose, but in the main it's very easy going. So everybody else we saw were riding big bikes, so 700s, 900s, you know, through to the 1200cc bikes, and they were all doing fine, but we just prefer the smaller bikes. So before I leave the topic of the bikes, I just have to address a question that I get all the time about you know, riding my KTM for this kind of long distance touring. What about the service intervals? What about the oil changes? Well, the answer to that is that if you're touring, and you can see from the video footage, we're just pottering along, you are not stressing the engine nearly as much as you are if you're using the bike for racing. KTM service intervals are for racing, and so you don't need to service them nearly as much if you're not really thrashing the engine like that. So I changed the oil on my KTM just before we left, and I changed it just after I got back, and the oil was still very clean that I dropped out, and that was after 2,500 mile trip. So I felt perfectly comfortable with that. So yes, the KTM is a viable long distance you know, touring bike. Obviously it's not as good as a bike that's got, say, 6, 8, 10,000 mile service intervals, but you know, having to change the oil every couple of weeks is not really a pain in my book, particularly as the oil is so easy to change on the KTM. It's, you know, once you've got it down, it's literally a 10-minute job. So before I leave the topic of the bikes, let's talk about our choice of tyres. We all changed our tyres for this trip because in the UK we normally run knobblies, quite aggressive knobblies, just because of the kind of terrain that we're normally riding on around Northumberland where we all live. So for this trip we all put on 50/50 tyres with inner tubes, and we used heavy duty inner tubes. I actually put in the Michelin extra heavy duty inner tubes. None of us had a puncture the whole trip, so we had no problems at all with these. So Peter and I used Mitas tyres, Mitas E7s. Brian was using something very similar, Golden Tyre GT 201, which is almost identical to the Mitas. Shiplo had a slightly different choice. He put on Moto's Extreme Hybrid tyres, which the rear is slightly more kind of aggressive. It's more like a trials bike tyre, actually, is that. But he used a Kendo K 270 front, which I think was not quite as sure-footed as our tyres on the front. So how did we get on those tyres? No problem, they were absolutely great. The only time where, you know, the footing was less than secure was when we did a very few muddy sections, and you'd need some fairly aggressive knobbly tyres on to be sure-footed on that kind of terrain, so no complaints about that. And in terms of wearage, well, when we got back, I fitted my Mitas tyres new for this trip. We got back after 2,500 miles, very little noticeable wear. on my Midas tyres. Of course, this is another advantage of running such a lightweight bike. It's a lot less heavy on the tyres. So yeah, it was there's loads and loads of mileage left in those tyres. I've yet to find how much mileage I get out of those. Okay, so that's the bikes. Let's move on and talk about accommodation. We all carried small hiking tents with us on the trip, and we did camp a few nights, but that was really just whilst we were off the TET. Whilst we were on the TET, every night we stayed at one of these, what the Swedish call these wind shelters, which in the main part are free. I'll flash an image on the screen, but you'll know what I'm talking about if you've watched the videos of the trip. And you can access a map which shows you where they are all located and gives you a description. So that's how we found it. Every day we looked on the map, we found a shelter close to where we wanted to go, and then headed for it. So I will provide a link to that map in the video description below. Okay, so let's talk about luggage and kit list. So we all had different panniers. Brian, myself and Shiplo, we all had soft pannier systems. Peter had hard panniers mounted on his bike. I favour the Krieger system, the Krieger pannier system, the OS system, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you don't need any kind of pannier rack or support with the Krieger system. It's got a very clever harness which straps onto your bike, and then the other great thing about them is the bags are interchangeable. So I have different bags. So for example, for riding around the UK locally, I have some I think they're 8-litre bags, and then I have some or maybe smaller than that, I can't remember now. And then for going off touring, like on this trip, I have the bigger bags, the biggest bags, which I think are 18-litre bags. And then I use a dry bag, a roll bag, across the back seat. And I find with that I can carry as much stuff as I want to. I wouldn't want to be carrying more weight on the back of the bike than I can get in those bags. Normally, I'm carrying about 15 kilograms worth of luggage. On this trip, I was carrying more because we took extra stuff in terms of extra tools, supplies, and I took a large tarpaulin as well in case we encountered bad weather. So yeah, but there are other. I'm not saying that the Krieger is the best. That's just what I use and it works for me. There are several other systems that are very similar, but I find that they are the best ones for dirt bikes. And also, if you do drop the bike, you do come off, you're less likely to damage the soft bikes. You might damage something inside the bags, but you're not going to damage the bags themselves because they just squash. So as for the kit list, well, I can't start going into detail here about what we took, but in the video description I will put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page where you can download for free the complete kit list of what we took with us. And so I'll just say a word about how we organised kit. Now, we're all very experienced at going off on this kind of trip, and I do sort of long distance motorcycle tours frequently. So I have a very well established kit list. And so what we did, we divided the kit list into personal kits, stuff that you take for yourself, your hygiene products, spare clothes, your camping gear, your sleeping bag, etc. And then communal equipment, that stuff that we didn't need to duplicate, so we could share between us. And that included cooking equipment, spares, tools, things like that. So I will make both of these kit lists available for you if you want to download them on my Buy Me a Coffee account. That will be free, and there will be a link in the description below. Okay, so let's move on to a very important question, which is what did it all cost? So I will flash up on the screen a breakdown of the costs for this trip. And as you will see from that breakdown of costs, by far the biggest cost was the overnight ferry from Newcastle to Amsterdam. Even sharing a 4-berth cabin between the 4 of us, it cost us £570 each. And it's interesting, just by comparison, the overnight ferry, so it's another overnight ferry from Travemünde in Germany across to Malmö in Sweden, cost only £110, and we had actually 2 twin cabins on that one. So, you know, sorry to have a bit of a rant, but the Newcastle ferry is just so extortionately expensive. It's a real rip-off. If you have the time to ride down through the UK to the Eurotunnel, or if you live south in the UK, it's much better value just to go through the Eurotunnel and, you know, and then ride up through France. But due to time and convenience, we decided to take that ferry. But on top of that, the Oresund Bridge, on which we took on the way back, that has a bridge toll of £60 UK. And the Puttgarden ferry, which is a relatively short ferry crossing, so that's the one from the south of Denmark back into Germany on our return journey, that was just £65. You don't need to pre-book that ferry, you can just turn up and pay. So all of that, those costs were just sort of getting to and from Sweden. The actual cost of riding the TET in Sweden was very, very small. So we used an average of about £15 worth of fuel every day. You know, these are small light bikes with very good fuel economy, so even though we were doing about 160 miles per day, we were only using a very small amount of fuel, so that didn't cost much at all, just over £200. Likewise with food, we took our camping stoves with us, and every day we called into a supermarket, we bought some food. It usually came to about £40 between the 4 of us, and that made for the evening meal and for breakfast and for snacks during the day. So the only costs over and above that is we stopped for a coffee and a piece of cake or something like that during the day if we came across civilization. So again, averaging about £15 a day on food. So the time that we spent on the TET, the 10 days we spent on the TET, cost us less than £500. It's a very, very cheap holiday, and that's one of the things I love about this kind of lightweight adventure traveling, where you're camping, you know, you're not staying in hotels, and because you're camping, you're doing your own cooking. It's relatively cheap, which means that you can afford to do more of it. You know, you can have more trips, you can go off for longer. So looking at that breakdown, the total cost of the whole trip was just over £1,200, which I consider to be excellent value for the fun and adventure that we had away. And that brings me to the final topic, which is what should you wear when you do a trip like this? You know, what would I advise you wear? Well, it's a very personal thing, and everybody's got their own ideas. And really, what I say to you is just over time, with experience of doing trips like this, you find out what works for you. And I've been doing this kind of touring for over 40 years now. Yeah, that's right, 40, over 40 years. And so over time, I've kind of really refined what I wear. So for me, it's always a balance between comfort and convenience and safety, because obviously you have to be aware of the safety aspect of riding. But my preferred approach is layering, to layer up, have less, so you can adjust what you wear according to the weather and the temperature. So I tend to wear a base layer of merino wool garments, and on this trip I wore a short sleeve merino wool t-shirt, but I was carrying with me a longer sleeve merino top as well. I'll then wear a mid layer, which has extra warmth and a bit of windproof, and then a lightweight jacket. Now, you could choose to wear body armour, but for convenience on this, I wore a jacket with armour built in. So it was a climb jacket that I was wearing, a lightweight climb jacket, and it's a vented jacket as well. So when the weather's hot, it's very comfortable. And when the weather's hot, you just wear the climb jacket with the t-shirt underneath, and you get plenty of ventilation, and that's very comfortable. If it gets a bit cooler, I put a warmer layer underneath. I also have a Pertex windproof layer that I can put on as a windstopper underneath the jacket, and then separate waterproof. So on a longer trip like this, I will always carry separate waterproofs rather than wearing a waterproof or a Gore-Tex jacket. I do have Gore-Tex jackets, I have several of them, and if I'm riding in the UK, say on a day's ride or a couple of days ride, and I know the weather's going to be appalling the whole time, then I'll wear my Gore-Tex. But for a trip like this, which if you watch the videos you can see we had very warm days, a lot of sunshine, and then we had days of heavy rain as well. You need that versatility. Shiplo and Peter were both wearing Gore-Tex jackets all the time, and they found that when the weather was warm they were getting very hot and quite sweaty inside those jackets, you know, even with the vents open. So, you know, it's my preference is, I tend to get quite warm when I'm riding, particularly off-road, but my preference is to wear light and to layer up. But it's quite a complex topic, is this, so I will probably make a separate video all about what I wear when I'm doing this kind of longer distance riding, because I think it merits a video of its own. Okay, so I think I've covered all of the topics that people had asked questions about. If I haven't, please do drop a question in the comments box below. But I do hope you found this useful if you are planning on doing a trip like this, or thinking of doing a trip like this. I hope the information in this video has been useful. That's the whole purpose of making this video, is to try and help other people out. If you've enjoyed it, please give the video a like. Please consider subscribing to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you again soon in a future video where I'm sharing more of my adventures. Thanks very much for watching. Bye.